It was March 18th, 1983, and a man named Salvatore Avellino was attending a dinner dance at the Huntington Townhouse on Long Island with his wife. He had no idea that while he was inside, 3 agents from the New York State Organized Crime Task Force had climbed the parking lot fence, popped the dashboard of his Jaguar, and spent 50 minutes installing a listening device they had practiced placing on an identical car. When Avellino and his wife walked back to that car later that night, it looked exactly the same as when they left it. It would take years for Anthony Corallo to understand what that evening actually cost him. And by the time he did, it was already over. Keep that image in mind. We are coming back to it. Goodfellas is one of the greatest mob movies ever made. If you have seen it, you already know Paul Cicero. He is the man at the restaurant table, the man the wise guys treat with a kind of reverence that borders on religious. He controls the neighborhood, controls the crews, controls who works and who does not. When Henry Hill describes him, he sounds like a king. Paul Cicero was based on a real man named Paul Vario. Vario was a caporegime, a crew captain, not the boss of anything above his own people. So how did the actual boss of the Lucchese crime family, the man Vario reported to, the man who sat on the most powerful governing body in the history of American organized crime, never appear once in the entire film? Nobody was paying attention to Anthony Corallo when he was coming up. He was born on February 12, 1913, in East Harlem, the son of Italian immigrants who had settled into a neighborhood that was already, by the 1920s, a reliable pipeline into organized crime. The streets were called the neighborhood. The gangs were called the boys. And the organization those boys fed was the one already being built by men like Tommy Lucchese and Lucky Luciano a few miles away. Corallo ran with the 107th Street gang in his early teens. His first arrest came at 16 for grand larceny. He was not convicted. He went on to be arrested more than a dozen more times over the next 30 years. He was not convicted in those cases either. Tommy Lucchese watched this from above and reportedly said, after one particularly impressive dismissal, Tony Ducks again. The name stuck, and in the world Corallo was building his career inside, a nickname like that is not a joke. It is a credential. By 1943, he was a capo running his own crew. He had moved his base of operations from East Harlem to Queens. He had learned the 2 things that would define the next 40 years of his life: how to make money through institutions and how to make it disappear before anyone could find it. The first thing you need to understand about Corallo's operation is that it was almost entirely invisible from street level, which is exactly where Goodfellas lives. Henry Hill's world was furs and bookmaking and airport cargo. It was a world of crews and neighborhood loyalty and short-term thinking. Corallo's world was different. He was thinking in decades, not seasons. In the 1950s, working alongside an associate named Johnny Dio, Corallo began one of the most sophisticated financial extraction operations in the history of American labor. They targeted union locals, specifically chapters affiliated with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and several garment district unions in Manhattan. Corallo and Dio stuffed these locals with compliant officers they could rely on. Workers paid dues that never reached pension funds. Business owners paid fees to avoid strikes that would never have happened anyway. The money flowed up and sideways through a network so diffuse that even experienced investigators had trouble tracing it to a single source. Nobody saw it from the street because it was not happening on the street. Jimmy Hoffa was their partner in this arrangement. Hoffa needed mob-connected figures to hold his loyalists in place inside the Teamsters. Corallo and Dio needed access to the pension funds and the leverage that came with controlling who drove trucks, who moved goods, and who worked the docks. The arrangement worked for everyone at the top and nobody at the bottom. By the time the McClellan Committee the Senate's landmark investigation into union corruption, called Corallo to testify in 1959, he was already too embedded to simply be removed. You cannot pull one thread out of a net that size without the whole thing moving. He was cited by name in those hearings. He was not convicted. That was only round one. In 1962, Corallo was convicted of bribery and sent to state prison for 2 years. In 1968, he went to federal prison for 3 years, this time over a case involving the New York City Water Commissioner, a man named James Marcus, who had borrowed money from Corallo-connected loan shark operations and repaid the debt by steering city construction contracts to Corallo's people. When the scheme unraveled, both men went down. It was a glimpse into something most people missed. The mob had not just infiltrated the street corners. It had infiltrated the administrative machinery of one of the largest cities in the world, and it had done it quietly enough that a federal investigation was required to see it at all. Corallo served those sentences. While he was serving them, Carmine Tremonti held the Lucchese family together as acting boss. In 1973, Tremonti was indicted for financing the French Connection heroin operation. By 1974, he had been convicted and sentenced to 15 years. The timing, looking back on it, could not have been more precise. Tremonti was in. Corallo was out, the chair was open. By 1974, Corallo was the undisputed boss of the Lucchese crime family, and his first move told you everything about how he intended to run things. Paul Vario had been one of the family's most senior captains before his own prison stint. When Vario got out and returned to the family, he expected a seat at the top of the hierarchy. He had seniority, he had history. By any traditional logic of mob promotion, he had earned it. Corallo said no. He installed Salvatore Tom Mix Santoro as underboss. Vario was left as a captain, powerful and well-connected, but a captain. I find this decision genuinely interesting because it tells you that Corallo was not running a loyalty operation. He was running a functional one. Vario was too flamboyant, too visible, too connected to street-level activities that drew exactly the kind of attention Corallo spent his career avoiding. Santoro was reliable and discreet. Corallo chose the tool he actually needed over the man who had been waiting. Paul Vario would go on to become the inspiration for the most famous mob boss in cinema history. The real boss chose someone else for the job. The Lucchese family under Corallo was not a single operation. It was several overlapping industries, each generating money through a different mechanism, and each designed so that a problem in one area did not automatically contaminate the others. Construction was central. With Santoro overseeing labor and bid rigging across New York, the family had a hand in determining who got city contracts, who supplied concrete and steel, and how much competitors were allowed to bid before they were persuaded otherwise. And the concrete workers and other construction locals were under varying degrees of mob influence. If you were building anything significant in New York during the 1970s and early 1980s, someone in that process was paying someone who eventually paid someone connected to Corallo. And that payment did not look like a bribe. It looked like the cost of doing business in a complicated city. Long Island Garbage was another arm. Corallo's driver and bodyguard, Salvatore Avellino, ran the Private Sanitation Industry Association of Nassau and Suffolk counties. This was technically a trade association for independent carting companies. In practice, it was a mob-controlled cartel that divided routes among approved haulers and fixed prices throughout the region. Business owners who tried to hire non-approved carters were visited by people who explained the situation calmly and once. The association generated millions per year and was nearly impossible to attack because it was structured to look like exactly what it claimed to be. Then there was the drug trade, which gets complicated quickly. The commission had theoretically banned narcotics, but the ban was about as enforceable as a suggestion. Under Corallo's leadership, Lucchese associates were supplying Leroy Barnes, called Nicky, known as Mr. Untouchable of Harlem, with large quantities of heroin during the early 1970s. The money flowing from that arrangement was enormous. The harm flowing from it through Harlem streets and into thousands of families was something Corallo presumably did not think about. And then there was JFK Airport. The Lucchese family had been running theft operations at Kennedy for decades, pulling cargo out of terminals through a network of union representatives, baggage handlers, and dock workers who were either on the payroll or afraid not to be. On December 11, 1978, Jimmy Burke, one of Vario's men, walked a crew into the Lufthansa cargo terminal at 3 in the morning and walked out with $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry. It was the largest cash robbery in American history up to that point. Burke reported to Vario. Vario reported to Corallo. And nobody in Goodfellas ever says that name. If you are finding this story worth your time, hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. While all of this was happening, the federal government was assembling something new. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, the FBI's understanding of organized crime had been slowly transforming. The old approach was to charge individual crimes against individual suspects. What prosecutors like Rudy Giuliani were beginning to see was that this approach, however many convictions it produced, left the structure intact. You could convict a captain and the family kept running. You could convict a boss and the underboss stepped up. The organization itself was never damaged. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, offered something different. Under RICO, the organization itself could be charged as a criminal enterprise. Membership in the structure became evidence. The commission, the governing body of the New York mob, could be treated not as an abstraction, but as the board of directors of a criminal corporation. You could charge all of them at once. In February of 1985, Rudy Giuliani, then U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, indicted the leadership of all 5 New York families simultaneously. Corallo, Santoro, and Fernari represented the Lucchese family. Sitting next to them at the defense table were the bosses or acting bosses of the Gambino, Genovese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. In all the history of the American mob, nothing like this had ever happened before. Corallo had survived every single investigation aimed at him for 50 years. He had ducked grand juries and bribery charges and narcotics cases. He had watched contemporaries fall and replaced them. He had run one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world with a discipline and a silence that his own people described with something approaching awe. Corallo was 71 years old when he sat down at that defense table, and he had spent most of his adult life making sure a moment like this would never happen. And then they played the tapes. This is the part that still, to me, does not fully compute. Here's a man who spent 5 decades being extraordinarily careful, who avoided restaurants because you never knew who had the table bugged, who spoke carefully and rarely, who had built a reputation for silence that was nearly legendary inside the organization. And in the back seat of his driver's Jaguar, rolling through Long Island and Queens, he talked. He talked about commission meetings. He talked about construction rackets. He talked about family hierarchy and decision-making and the names of people who mattered. He talked the way you talk when you believe you are having a private conversation with someone you trust completely. Over the course of roughly 2 years following that March night at the Huntington Townhouse, the OCTF recorded thousands of hours of those conversations. Every word went into a federal case file. Every word eventually went in front of a jury. My best guess, and I have gone back and forth on this, is that the car felt like a safe space in a way a restaurant or a home never could. There is no one to overhear you. It is just you and your driver moving through traffic. For a man always on guard in every room he entered, Maybe the back seat of that Jaguar was the only place he ever truly stopped watching the door. The agents who placed that bug understood human psychology better than Corallo did. On November 19, 1986, after a trial that had lasted the better part of a year and a half, all 8 defendants were convicted on racketeering charges. The courtroom in Lower Manhattan was, by all accounts, completely silent when the verdict was read. On January 13, 1987, Judge Richard Owen sentenced Anthony Corallo to 100 years in federal prison. The same sentence went to Anthony Salerno, known as Fat Tony, of the Genovese family, and Carmine Persico of the Colombo family. Corallo was 73 years old. 100 years. You do not need a calculator for that math. In the immediate aftermath of the conviction, the 5 families held what amounted to an emergency meeting about Rudy Giuliani. According to an FBI informant, Gotti and Persico had backed a plan to have Giuliani killed. The families representing the Bonanno, Lucchese, and Genovese organizations voted against it. The plan went nowhere. That rejection may have been the one genuinely wise decision made by any of these men during that entire period. Anthony Corallo served every day of his remaining life in federal custody. He never cooperated. He never gave an interview. He never filed a memoir. He died at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri on August 23, 2000, at the age of 87. 13 years after that verdict, he was gone in the same silence he had always kept. 6 of the men convicted in the commission trial died in federal prison. The trial did not end the New York mob, but it did something the mob had never fully prepared for. It removed the entire top layer in a single afternoon. He went to prison the way he had done everything else, quietly, on his own terms, without explanation. Now think back to that parking lot at the Huntington townhouse, the agents climbing the fence at night, the 50 minutes inside the dashboard of a car that belonged to a man whose wife was inside at a dinner dance, the transmitter no bigger than a matchbook, the man who ducked more than a dozen prosecutions across 3 decades, the man who built an empire so carefully constructed it barely left a fingerprint in the public record, the man who sat at the head of the New York Commission and whose name never once appears in the most celebrated mob movie ever made, was brought down not by an informant, not by a phone tap, not by a raid on a known location. He was caught in a Jaguar. The real question about Anthony Corallo is not how the government got him. The real question is what it says about every institution he touched, every union local, every city contract, every construction bid, every garbage route, and every cargo terminal, that it took this long. If you want to go deeper on the bosses the films never showed you, there is more on screen right now. Subscribe and keep coming back for the real stories behind the men who ran New York from rooms the cameras never found.